Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Schottenstein-Fisher. I am a JDC board member, and I chair the JDC Archives Committee. Thank you for joining us today. I am so happy to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the fifth program of our series on Young Lives in Turmoil and Transformation, JDC's work with children in the 20th century. But first, a few words about the archives. The JDC Archives houses the records of JDC, the leading global Jewish humanitarian organization, since its creation over a century ago. Visiting scholars from all over the world utilize our unique offerings for their own research, as do publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and editors. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Sommer Schneider. Anna is Associate Professor of Practice of Jewish Civilization at the Center for Jewish Civilization of the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Anna received her PhD from the Department of Jewish Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. She's the author of She'arit HaPlata, Surviving Remnant, the activities of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in Poland, 1945 to 1989. It's published in Polish, and co-author with JDC's own Linda Levy of Rescue, Relief, and Renewal, 100 Years of the Joint in Poland. She's also the author of numerous scholarly and critical articles on Holocaust memory, the history of the Jews in post-World War II Poland, as well as the history of anti-Semitism, published both in Polish and in English. Today, Sommer Schneider will give a lecture entitled Yiddishkeit and JDC's Support for Jewish Education in Communist Poland. So our format is that our guest speaker will speak for roughly 45 minutes, and then we will entertain questions. Please note that your microphones are turned off, you are muted, and we will take questions via the Q&A function on your computer. You can send us questions at any time during Anna's lecture. Anna, turn it over to you now to begin your lecture.
Thank you so much, Linda, for this kind introduction. And I also want to use this opportunity to thank Isabel Rohr for inviting me to present today. This is a wonderful opportunity. And I also want to take this, I also want to thank so many wonderful people at JDC Archives who in so many different ways supported my work over the last few years. It's actually close to a decade now. I'm thinking particularly about Linda Levy and Misha Mitzel. Misha was wonderful in providing guidance through the vast collection of JDC archive at the time when I was working first on my dissertation and later my book. And today's conversation will focus on JDC's support for Jewish education in post-Holocaust Poland, although I will first provide brief context to the situation position of Jewish children and adolescents who greatly benefited from that assistance provided by JDC. As we all know, Poland suffered unprecedented destruction as a result of World War II. Not only the country was devastated but her population was literally shattered. Out of approximately 6 million Polish citizens who were murdered during World War II, close to 3 million were Jews, and this is almost entire Jewish pre-World War II population. We estimate that nearly 90% of pre-World War II Polish Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. And during my presentation, I will be sharing some amazing photographs which I found in JDC archives, like the two you can now see on the screen. In a photograph on the right side, we can see some Jewish women walking on the rubble of Warsaw after the city was liberated from German occupation. And on the left side, we see representatives of JDC who were present in Warsaw almost immediately after German troops left that place, of course, trying to find the best way to provide assistance for the surviving remnant of Polish Jews. Of course, today we know that there was barely a handful of Jewish children who survived the Holocaust. Probably they were not more than 5,000 of the youngest members of the pre-war Jewish community who survived the war. And most of them were either orphans or semi-orphans. These are a couple more photographs taken in different parts of Poland in orphanages, which were supported by JDC. After the war, those orphanages were established across the country. And when it comes to the number of children, we know that it was constantly changing. For example, in July of 1946, this number of 5,000 increased to approximately 25,000 as a result of repatriation of Polish citizens from the Soviet Union. And that number soon decreased to about 15,000 after the, as a result of mass immigration of Jewish people after the infamous Kielce pogrom in July of 1946. Of course, not only the community was shattered, but also the structures of Jewish life were almost entirely destroyed, and trying to create foundations or simply support in any possible way the decimated Jewish community. As early as the fall of 1944, the surviving remnant of Polish Jews created what's called a temporary committee, a temporary central committee of Jews in Poland. This was, I would say, some sort of an umbrella institution organization which supervised many different Jewish organizations which operated in Poland in the immediate post-war period, I would say until 1949. The leadership of this newly created institution soon reached out to foreign Jewish organizations with an appeal for immediate assistance for the surviving Jews in Poland. And it's not surprising that the addressee of that appeal was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, in America known as the JDC. In Poland, we would rather say the Joint. JDC was a natural choice for several reasons, that being, or this particular organization provided assistance in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe long before the outbreak of the war. So their employees, staff, they had excellent, wonderful experience working on the ground, and of course, understanding this community very well. What was also important was that JDC was in a political organization. And that was really critical for the communist authorities in post-World War II Poland, that the JDC had a reputation of an institution who was staying away from politics. Actually, for that same reasons that I just mentioned, President Truman invited JDC representatives to visit DP camps along with Mr. Harrison soon after the liberation of the camps. And another reason, which is equally important, unlike communist authorities, JDC had resources to support Polish Jews. JDC, this is another great photograph, one of my favorite actually. This photograph was taken in a well-known orphanage in Otwock, which is not far from Warsaw. And in the photograph on the left side, we can see a group of children still barefoot, wearing their old clothing. And this was taken right before they received their new beautiful clothes and shoes from JDC. And we'll have an opportunity to see more equally interesting photographs. This one shows distribution or rather delivery of some supplies provided by JDC. What's important, actually, JDC started providing assistance to surviving Jews in Poland as early as 1944. So that's before the organization was authorized to legally operate in Poland. And since, again, JDC leaders had a long-lasting experience of working in this part of the world, the organization's representatives were intent from the outset on mobilizing the community of Polish Jews to actively seek work or a suitable trade, leading to a paid employment. In other words, instead of focusing on giving people money and some other material help, JDC's leaders said, well, we will help you to put your lives together, but you need to help us, right? In order to accomplish this, we will focus our efforts on setting up professional training, creating special loan banks, they were called casas, organizations, and we'll be working as an agent in the purchasing professional materials, but you need to participate, you need to help us, and you will be actively engaged in rebuilding Jewish life or foundations of Jewish life in this new reality. And of course, thanks to the models, which was set up long before the outbreak of the Second World War, immediately after the liberation, immediately after the end of hostilities in Poland, I should say, it was possible to began rebuilding the foundations of life for the small handful of surviving Jews. This work including schooling, education, cultural work, which had a extremely significant impact on the development of education of Jewish youth in the later years. One of the JDC's operating principles had been involving local leaders in its work. Similarly, local institutions were made responsible for distributions of funds and other supplies. And well, I would say it was some sort of a trap, because soon the leaders of the Central Committee, which I mentioned before, this umbrella institution, they tried to assume complete control over monetary aid provided by JDC, believing that this will allow them to rebuild the Jewish community's lives based on their ideological assumptions, namely the advance of secularization and assimilation. And of course, that also included education. Needless to say, this policy, represented by a fairly large number of members of the Central Committee's leadership, led to endless conflict between representatives of some other Jewish institutions and organizations, especially Zionist or religious community, and eventually JDC leaders themselves. If the leaders of the Central Committee had accomplished their goals, this would have threatened Polish Jews with complete secularization and assimilation. And this policy really stood in contradiction with the overriding aims of the JDC's leadership in New York. of course, for the future of Jewish community in this part of Europe. Retaining the traditional forms of life based on appropriate education of children and young people was one of the JDC's principles. Therefore, from the start, JDC supported not only Central Committee, but they also tried to provide necessary assistance to Zionist organizations and also Jewish traditional religious institutions, which also provided their charges with education. Caring for children and also education of the youngest members of Jewish community was under the responsibility of the Central Committee's Department of Child Protection, and also Central Committee supervised most of the orphanages and schools in the entire country. First, the childcare institution for orphan Jewish children was established in Lublin as early as summer of 1944. So again, this is long before the entire country, Poland, was liberated from German occupation. Over the next few months, similar facilities began operating across the country. Providing assistance for the youngest members of Jewish community was always an operational priority for JDC. And whenever JDC leaders visited Poland, they always went to see children's homes, sanatoria, or summer camps. We have an example. There are a couple more photographs presenting Mr. Moses Levitt and Mr. Schwartz, also two other representatives of UJA and JDC. Gitler Barsky was one of the surviving leaders of JDC who was involved in the work of the organization before the war. And of course, whenever they visited Poland, they would always go to see the youngest members of the Jewish community, and of course, these children knew very well who these people were. And what's probably more important, they were fully aware that these were the people who supplied the foster homes with all the beautiful toys and the sweetest candy in the world and the most beautiful and fancy clothing. So it's not surprising that, for example, when Joseph Hyman was leaving the orphanage that we've seen before in the photographs in Otwock outside of Warsaw, children would say to him, "Goodbye, Papa Joint." That was probably his nickname. And just like healthcare institutions and orphanages, also Jewish education was organized in pretty much every larger city in Poland. The first such school run by Central Committee was set up in Białystok as early as 1944. Well, of course, we need to understand the realities were very harsh, because many of these teachers who taught at the Jewish schools were untrained. Therefore, efforts were made whenever possible to organize help and support for those people who were undertaking this very difficult and responsible task. In the years following the end of the war, there were a variety of Jewish schools established across the country, which included private schools, and those schools existed until April of 1949, when all of them were nationalized on the instructions of the Ministry of Education. Private education was provided primarily by Zionist organizations. We estimate that by 1941, approximately 1,000 children pursued education in such schools, which were entirely funded by JDC. Many, if not most of them, existed within newly established kibbutzim, and I remember having conversation with someone in the past who tried to correct me. Oh, well, you probably put that wrong. There were no kibbutzim outside of Palestine, later Israel. That's not necessarily true. There were kibbutzim established by Zionist organizations in Poland after the war, and very successful, supporting both young survivors and adults alike. Of course, the Zionist school's principle was to prepare young Holocaust survivors for immigration to Israel. Therefore, the language of the instruction in these schools was Hebrew. And it's interesting that in the post-war schools, actually authorities allowed to teach in Jewish schools or to provide instructions either in Hebrew or Yiddish. Significant number of Jewish children and youth attended also traditional religious schools called Talmud Torah. Although these schools focus on religious studies, yet they were compelled to provide secular education in line with the requirements of Polish Ministry of Education. These schools also offered afternoon program for children attending Central Committee schools, which were secular. We estimate that in 1948, about 1,100 children pursued education in the schools, which is actually higher than children attending Zionist schools. And although various Jewish organizations and communities organize all types of schools, yet the Central Committee set up the greatest number of schools across the country compared to the two previous institutions. The number of children attending schools run by Central Committee is much higher, about 4,350 children in the late 1940s. Of course, all of them had a secular character, as I already explained. However, Yiddish was an official language of instruction, since Yiddish was considered a key element in the formation of the Jewish spirit and character. In the first years following the war, Polish authorities approved Yiddish as the language of instruction. However, the majority of children and adolescent survivors had been detached from the natural environment. Many of these children who went to schools after the war survived the Holocaust in hiding. And of course, for those children, Yiddish posed truly a great challenge. So this was principal factor which finally eliminated any possibility for the Yiddish culture or its revival as the Polish Jews' national language, despite all the efforts of Jewish activists. And this is how young survivors spoke of Yiddish. Michał Feierstein, in a conversation with Jana Wiśniewicz many years after the war, many years actually after the fall of the communism in Poland, he said, "We looked down on Yiddish. I never learned Yiddish. I always wanted to learn Hebrew, but they didn't teach Hebrew there," meaning in the Jewish school. "We made it clear to them that Hebrew would be different from Yiddish, for Yiddish was ghetto talk. That's how we saw it. We were just so mature. And they told us that we couldn't, that Hebrew was banned as a Zionist imperialist language, that Israel was imperialist. That's what they told us." Again, there was absolutely impossible to imagine rebirth of Yiddish, and the same as we saw it in Poland before the Holocaust. But if we talk of a Jewish education after the war, we cannot ignore schools established for adolescents and adults, which were also funded by JDC, which played a critical role in revival of Jewish life after the Holocaust. This type of education was vocational training, usually run by the Association for the Support of Trades and Agriculture among the Jews, known as ORT, and which, like a number of other Jewish organizations, was founded by JDC. These schools played a key educational role, but I would say it is equally important, or perhaps even more important, they were fundamental in the process of Holocaust survivors' psychological recovery. In time, groups of Jews repatriated from the Soviet Union, and I already mentioned that important group of survivors. They also took advantage of this vocational training. The art schools offered different levels of education. They were regular vocational classes, short-term courses for specific trades, and special courses organized for the Solidarity Center of Manufacturing Cooperatives. And then these are, this is an example how how the schools operated, and they were often collaborating with Jewish cooperatives. This particular form of help allowed the Jewish community in Poland to develop independent and only Jewish cooperatives, which provided employment and financial independence for individual Jews, but also communal institutions, including Jewish schools. And here, JDC played a critical role because there was some sort of an agreement that the JDC will provide appropriate material and any form of assistance to the cooperatives, but they, in return, part of the income from the cooperatives was designated for operation of Jewish institutions in a country. This honeymoon with the Polish government, I would say, and this form of activities developed after the Holocaust in Poland did not last long. As early as 1949, all Jewish institutions, organizations were disbanded, including Central Committee of the Jews in Poland. JDC was forced to terminate operations in the country, and at that time, Jewish education became much more challenging issue. The new organization representing Jewish community, which was soon established, the Sociocultural Association of the Jews in Poland, really fulfilled guidelines of the new regime and voluntarily relinquished traditional Jewish form of lives and Jewish education. Though in the late 1950s, and I'll be talking about this in a minute, the joint resumed operations in Poland, the question of Jewish education became a contentious issue. And frankly, until the fall of communism, Jewish learning remained an unsettled question. And there were discussions over it that assumed many different forms. And but since we are now slowly moving to the 1950s, it was not really until the second half of that decade, or the second half of the 1950s, when JDC returned and provided assistance to Jewish community, although the conditions were much more different. The JDC was not allowed to open official office in the country, and actually JDC's country director, Akiva Kohane, was commuting from Switzerland every 2 or so weeks. So JDC didn't really have that much impact or direct communication with Jewish institutions and organizations in the country. Of course, one of the most important tasks at that time was to draw up a new curriculum for children and educational institutions. The government put emphasis at that time on rekindling patriotic feelings among children. So there was no discussion about religiosity. There was no discussion about religious education or traditional education. Rather, schools were supposed to focus on bringing up children in the spirit of citation, attachment to the Polish and Jewish working class revolutionary tradition, and to heroes and martyrs. So they had to follow the line of other national schools in the country. There was a religious association operating in Poland. However, the community was steadily drifting away from traditional forms of life, and remaining Jews in Poland were quickly secularizing and merging into non-Jewish environment. This, on the other hand, corresponded with the aims of the communist government, namely nationalization of schools and integration of all minorities, not only Jewish, into Polish society. It should be noted that actually the direct and the official impetus to the communist authorities establishing or reestablishing a relationship with JDC was the planned another large wave of repatriation of thousands of Polish citizens from the Soviet Union. It was estimated that at that time, approximately 19,000 Jews arrived from Soviet Union. And of course, the majority of those arriving in Poland were Polish citizens, yet the government understood there were many Jews among them, and the government, the authorities could not really accommodate all the repatriates. Therefore, they again reach out to this New York-based organization. Today, we know that for many repatriated Jews or those arriving from Soviet Union, Poland was just a transit country on the way to the West, yet there were many people who were stuck in Poland for even a couple of years before they were able to move on. Of course, large numbers of these people had a tremendous problems finding work and paid employment. First of all, most of them didn't speak any Polish. They didn't have appropriate education, knowledge of trade or professions that would allow them to find that employment. Therefore, just like in the 1940s, JDC and ORT set up a number of professional trainings for these people. Also, with these people in mind, a number of schools, all kinds of schools were created across the country. That also applies to children of those repatriated Jews who, like the parents, often didn't speak the language and turn away from their natural environment, detached from the natural environment. It was very difficult for them really to develop relationship and friendships with the Polish peers. Therefore, there were schools set up with Polish, Russian, and Yiddish as the languages of instruction, since some of those children arriving from Soviet Union spoke Yiddish. However, everybody realized that the best place for young people to develop a relationship and friendships outside of schools were summer camps. And in 1959, almost 3,000 children participated in summer camps and courses co-funded by JDC. Of course, at that time for JDC, it was really important to prevent political indoctrination of those young Jews. But what was even more important was explaining to the children what Yiddishkeit was, what qualities were associated with being Jewish. That Jewishness was, above all, a way of life, and the importance of coexistence with members of the same community. For a great many young people, the time spent with the peers from the same nation and linked by a common tradition really helped to establish their identity. In 1959, Akiva Kohanen, the JDC country director, visited one of those summer camps, and that's what he said. I was very pleasantly surprised by the program of summer camps, which, in my opinion, could be the most important element of our work in Poland. 3,000 Jewish children take part in summer camps with other Jews. I was pleasantly surprised visiting these camps to see that in principle, they are in no way different from these types of camps organized elsewhere in Europe. Of course, there is no Israeli flag, which flutters over most camps in other European countries. Nor can you hear Hebrew songs. There are no shlichim and no discussion about Israel. Despite this, I was deeply moved when I saw the children singing in Yiddish and reading chapters from Peretz and Sholem Aleichem, replying to quiz questions such as, what is the name of the Israeli parliament, or which is the best theater in Israel? And this is what some of the Jewish campers said about the time they spent in those summer camps. Władek Poznański, in a conversation with Joanna Wiśniewicz, recalled, I met Jewish children for the first time at Jewish summer camps. I discovered a new world in these camps. The atmosphere was different from that at Polish camps or Scout camps, which I knew well. People behaved differently. There was some kind of special bond between the children and the instructors, or we should say counselors today. Everyone was on the first name terms. We even called Shmuel Tenenblatt, the camp leader, by his first name. At Polish camps, the Scout camps, there was always a sort of reserved discipline, while here we had the discipline and everything else, but without a reserve. I felt like a family, not a camp. Honestly, we all felt ourselves to be one big family. And another camper, Ms. Grohl, said, during that time of my development, Jewishness was becoming more important to me. I was trying to understand the secret of this difference that led me being sometimes not accepted in Polish circles. TSKZ stands for Socio-Cultural Association of the Jews in Poland, so, the institution that organized those camps. I went on one for the first time at the age of 15 that provided me with an additional dose of Jewish culture. It was there that a number of instructors led us into the Jewish world. Marek Webb was making up all sorts of Jewish tales, helping us to learn new things. We also sang songs in Yiddish. They taught us that the songs which supposedly our grandparents had sung, but then, of course, none of us knew our grandparents. So the camps, of course, had this amazing, tremendous impact on self-development and identity of people who were really raised outside of Jewishness. And even though there were some Jewish schools operating in the country at that time, but there were not really that many parents who decided to send their children to Jewish schools. They believed it would be better if their children integrate and attend schools with Polish children. They tried to prevent any form of mental isolation from Polish peers. However, what's really interesting the major incentive for parents to actually send their children to those schools run by Jewish institutions was feeding program provided in those schools. And just the fact that a child could receive either lunch or another form of meal at school was particularly important for those Jewish families arriving from the Soviet Union, but it was equally important for many Jews who lived in Poland at that time and they lost their employment due to increasing anti-Semitism. So these are a couple of photographs presenting children, Jewish children, and this eating the food provided by school and funded by school. And again, just like in the late 1940s, this form of cooperation with the communist authorities did not last long. In August 1967, right after the Six-Day War in the Middle East, the Joint was once again forced to terminate its work in Poland. As a result, the Jewish life was literally frozen for at least 12 years, and this form of hibernation lasted until the end of the 1970s. Although the JDC didn't really have any impact on the changes within the Jewish community at that time, the return of the organization in January of 1982 helped rebuilding Jewish life in Poland. And although the activities were really limited to supporting some of the secular clubs run by the Cultural Association of Jews in Poland, and they were really run by and for older members of the Jewish community who had more of the sentimental attachment to that world. It was rare to observe religious practices at that time. JDC's country director, again, it was still Akiva Kahane, felt that within a few years, there won't be any Jewish community in Poland because there are no young people. As he recalled, every week there are several funerals, and furthermore, from his perspective, rebuilding the Jewish community in Poland was a lost cause because, as he said, we want to be able to make this community self-sufficient. Therefore, Kahane believed that responsibility of the JDC and also Jewish community worldwide was to ensure that the elderly representatives of the Jewish community in Poland spent their final years in dignity. We know today that this grim scenario soon began to fade away. In the 1980s, young Polish Jews started meeting up in Świętbogów, which is a well-known facility home outside of Warsaw. It was used before the war and was critical after the war. It is still, it's been used by the Jewish community to this day. Summer camps are being organized there. And in the mid-1980s, Kahane started talking about these young people who are curious to learn more about their Jewishness, although they were mostly young people who were discovering their Jewish ancestry. They were not raised in Jewish homes. They were often raised in communist homes, detached from their heritage. But at that time, interest in Jewishness began to grow in popularity, and we actually see that in Poland today. In 1979, some of those young people created what was called Jewish Flying University, and for the most part, these young Polish intellectuals met up to discuss Jewish history, religion, and literature. So again, this facility in Świętbogów was the central place for the young people who rediscovered their tried to rediscover their Jewishness. But it was not really until the fall of communism and the early 1990s when traditional forms of Jewish education were reestablished in Poland, first in Warsaw and later other places. And let me stop talking here. I will conclude my presentation right now, but of course, I will be now happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was educational, enlightening, amazing, amazing pictures that tell a story. So I appreciate you being here. On behalf of all of us, thank you. And I will now open the floor to questions and go into the Q&A. Nancy Sivan would like to know, where did the Jewish orphans come from? Were they hidden children?
Yes, they were hidden children who survived with Polish families. And it's interesting that very important part of JDC work in Poland was actually to literally retrieve those children from Polish families. There was a special fund, allocation of money from JDC that was used for that very purpose. And many of these children eventually ended up living in Zionist kibbutzim. If they were not placed in orphanages, it was important for the Zionists to find those children, retrieve those children, and prepare them for further immigration to Israel.
Thank you. Michael Trayson has a couple questions. The first one is, was there significant interest in the survivors shown in the 1950s and 60s from family individuals in the United States?
Hello, Michael. Thank you for this question. There was never, at least from the documents that I had access to, there was always huge interest on the part of the Jewish community in the United States to support whatever life was Jewish life remained in Poland. Ziomkostwa, they were special Landsmannschaft and the organizations that were particularly interested in supporting Jewish communities in the small towns or even cities where they came from. So if that's the question, there was never really, from the documents, there was never really an issue of how to get the funding to support Jewish life in Poland, even or perhaps particularly during the communist era. Everybody knew the Jews needed that assistance more than, well, I want to say ever before, but the Jews really needed support always. And there are all different reasons. We could now go back to the pre-World War II era and why JDC was so critical, not only sustaining life and helping people survive, but also the funding provided by JDC was critical in fighting anti-Semitism, because the Jews really could create independence. Those cooperatives, the work that they were able to establish, their employment, thanks to the money coming from the United States, really saved them from many different forms of anti-Semitism that they could encounter in other places of work and places of employment.
And Michael's follow-up question was, who were the major local rabbis from 1945 to 1989, and where were they based?
Rabbis were really, the communities didn't really have, besides David Cohen, who was in Poland right after the liberation, traditional forms of lives were not really based on that form of religious guidance. Like there was, for example, no mohel in Poland at all. For circumcisions, they were usually inviting someone to come from many European countries, including Switzerland. So there were some traditional religious programs run in the country, but usually they were not really in that traditional form that we witness today. We know that Rabbi Michael Schudrick was actually the first rabbi to come and from New York. Poland didn't have trained rabbi prior to arrival of important rabbis from other countries, and to this day, he's New Yorker is the chief rabbi of Poland, right? So, I think we often have that different misconceptions about how Jewish life was organized at the time, and frankly, as we said, especially in the 1980s. People didn't really care that much about the traditional forms of life and also about religion. I mean, it was almost impossible to find minyan in synagogues at that time. So those who were still in Poland, older members of the Jewish community, they had sentimental attachment, but not that people really lived traditionally, if you know what I mean.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. And Robert Cohn is asking, were you able to follow up on any of the children in the Jewish camps in the 1950s? Did they retain their Jewish identity? Did they assimilate? Did they emigrate?
Mm-hmm. Well, many of these people who were interviewed by Jana Wiśniewicz, who were citations I used during this presentation, they were actually forced to leave Poland in the 1960s. I believe many in the audience are familiar with the anti-Semitic campaign, which was sponsored by the communist government in the late 1960s, the infamous March 68. And many of these people, of course, they're very sentimental about Poland. And those camps were really important in the sense that they could understand what it meant to be Jewish. We have to keep in mind that a lot of these people were raised in secular homes in mixed marriages. There rarely we find homes where they're both Jewish, with two Jewish parents who actually talk openly about their past, about their heritage. So those camps were actually the only place where they could learn anything about their Jewishness. I did talk to some of those campers, but these are people who live in the United States. There are very few who stayed in Poland, although there were those who later started the Jewish Flying Institute, University, and those people who were also raised outside of the faith or outside of tradition, not understanding what Yiddishkeit was, the many people who actually turned towards not only Jewishness, but also tradition and Judaism. So there are two things, right? Whether you're self-identified a Jew and you understand your Jewish identity, which is a core of who you are, but you don't necessarily follow the traditional religious rites. And those people who started understanding their heritage in Poland, primarily thanks to JDC's work and an education that they provided, they eventually turned towards Judaism. And now we see many people who observe in Jews. Poland is such an interesting country, really. This is not really associated with the topic of my talk, since we are talking about the post-1990s, but we now witness what's called a phenomena of deathbed confessions. The many older people, or have been in the last 2-3 decades, I'm talking about people who are my generation, whose parents or grandparents were Jewish. There's at least one parent in a family or one grandmother in a family who was Jewish, who never revealed her identity to anybody. And before he or she died, the many people who felt that this is the time to actually tell their children and grandchildren who they really are. And you can imagine if somebody who's in his or her 20s, 30s finds out that my grandmother is Jewish, and if this is maternal line, it means that actually I'm a Jew too. So, but what does it mean to be Jewish? I was really raised Catholic, and I follow one faith, but I want to learn more now. And I was really surprised when I went with my students from Georgetown University to JCC in Krakow a couple of years ago, and I realized that there are 700 members in a local JCC. So there's this revival of Jewish life. Again, the people who do not necessarily grew up in a Jewish households, understanding the legacy, but thanks to organizations like JDC, which is still active and flourishing in Poland, of course, we can learn. These people can learn more about themselves, about their identity.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been to that JCC too. It's not far from Auschwitz, and it's incredible what they do there. They're now really doing a lot of work with the Ukrainian refugees.
Yes.
Florence Levin wants clarification. Did the temporary Central Committee want the Polish Jewish population to actually assimilate after World War II, or only to secularize?
Secularize, not necessarily assimilate. So thank you for that question. If that was not clear in my presentation, especially in that period following the 1950s. In the 1950s, the founders and leaders of this association, they truly believe that they can build a Jewish cultural life around Yiddish culture. That was a core for them of understanding of what it means to be Jewish. So they drifted entirely away from religion and traditional forms of life, but they really cherished the Yiddish as the Jewish language, and to believe that this might be a core of Jewish identity and a foundation for Jewish life and Jewishness. That also ended in the late 1960s with the last wave of forced immigration from Poland, and well, after that, Yiddish entirely died out in the country. So today you have only scholars who can still speak the language. There are virtually almost no survivors. If there are any survivors, they were too young to learn Yiddish. So yeah, it was the point was rather to acculturate, to secularize a Jewish community, assimilate in a sense that we live with Poles, we abandoned that form of a mental ghetto that many people that we witness in pre-World War II Poland, when many Jewish people just isolated themselves, living in within their own communities and not really integrating with the environment, not necessarily assimilating, but integrating with the rest of the Polish population.
Deborah Bernick has a comment and a question. The Ort schools in Poland were partly funded by JDC and partly by their own funds as a separate organization working alongside JDC. My father, Paul Bernick, was head of American Ort from 1954 for 40 years. Was JDC in Poland affected by the assassination of Charles Jourdan in Prague in 1968? And did it have to work in secrecy?
Well, in 1968, after Charles Jourdan was assassinated, JDC formally didn't work in Poland any longer. In my work, I often talk about JDC being almost like litmus test for the Jewish community, because usually termination of JDC's work in Poland acknowledge that something's going to happen, that there will be some changes affecting Jewish community in the near future. That this is what happened in the 1940s and also in 1967. It was not 68 when JDC was forced to stop operations. Again, they were not forced really to leave because they were not physically present in Poland at that time. But it was as early as August of 1967, so only a couple of months after a 6-day war in the Middle East, when the Joint was forced to terminate any operations and providing any assistance. So technically in 1968, they were not in Poland. They were entirely isolated, and until 1982, they were not really allowed to, they couldn't really do much supporting Jewish community.
Thank you. And we have one final question from Bruce Udowitz. What was the balance of using schools after the war to provide nutrition and personal emotional recovery versus Jewish education? How did the Jewish education fit into the overall plan for rebuilding the Jewish community in Poland?
Oh, yeah, it is very complex and tricky question. Of course, we are talking about unspeakable. Right? Nobody can really understand, imagine what it was like to be Jewish in liberated Poland. And we also know that many people who either stayed after the liberation or came back to Poland after the liberation of Nazi concentration camps inside Germany, they didn't last long. But nobody knew at that time what the future held. And there were many Jews who actually had the faith, they believed that they could rebuild their lives in Poland after the war. This soon ended. I mean, it became clear within months after the war that Poland was not really that friendly for Jewish people any longer, with the pogroms that occurred in different parts of the country. I would say that orphanages, schools really supported the Jewish children, but many people realized that many of those kids, especially in orphanages, will not last long, that they will not stay in Poland. And of course, there was a lot of emphasis put on supporting immigration of those young people from Poland. Of course, there were also those children who were adopted by Polish families, but that's a question of, there are many who still may not know to this very day that they were Jewish, that they were hidden Jews, or they were adopted Jews after the war. The psychological recovery plays a critical role. The Jews don't really trust that many people, and they also feel better within a community of people who shared the same experience, who suffered the same way during the Holocaust. Therefore, kibbutzim and all those vocational trainings and all those corporates were critical for mental rehabilitation of the Jewish community after the war. For children to be in those orphanages at schools with other Jews, but also for adults, I think maybe even for adults, it played a more important role.
Thank you. Anna Sommer Schneider, thank you for joining us today. Again, it was a fantastic presentation, and I hope all of you enjoyed our program today. Please note that this program has been recorded, and it'll be available on the JDC Archives website and also on our YouTube channel in about 3 weeks. If you look at the chat, you can see some upcoming programs. Our next program will take place on June 14th. Robin Buller, recipient of the 2022 Sorel and Lorraine Chesson JDC Archives Fellowship, will give a lecture on Ottoman echoes, remnants of the empire among Sephardi immigrants to France, 1919 to 1945. So you can register, as I said, via the link in the chat box or on our JDC Archives Facebook page. We hope that you'll all be able to join us for that. And don't forget to sign up for our e-newsletter if you haven't. That way you can find out more about our public programming, and you can be added to our mailing list. Again, thank you all and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you so much.